I found out my husband slept with his ex because I was having trouble getting pregnant. It turns out he was the one with fertility problems. So I gave him divorce papers and walked away. My husband, 30 male, and I, 27 female, have been married for 2 years and have been trying to have a baby for the past 10 months. Unfortunately, we haven't had any success, and that's been putting a lot of strain on our relationship for the last few months. I really want a baby, and I know so does he, because he's always talked about starting a family, even while we were dating. This is something we had in common, our desire to have a child, and that's also why we didn't waste much time after getting married and began trying to conceive. I've been disappointed by the negative results, but I always tried to hold it together. He didn't do the same and would get upset every single time, then wouldn't speak to me for the next few days because he needed his space. His behavior would make me feel really guilty, as if it was entirely my fault that we weren't getting pregnant. About 6 months ago, I suggested that we get tested, because even then, he was acting out every month when we'd realized yet again pregnant. He's the one who turned that idea down, saying that we didn't need to waste our money on tests. We just had to keep trying. So that's what we continue to do? 3 weeks ago, after another negative pregnancy test, we argued because I suggested that we get tested. He snapped at me in a very cruel way and told me that he already knew who had issues, but he was trying not to hurt my feelings. There was no real reason for him to believe I was the one with fertility issues when we hadn't even been tested yet, and that's what led to the argument. What he said got to me, and I also brought up his behavior after our unsuccessful tries to get pregnant, blaming me for the failures constantly when it could have also been him. He said that he knew for a fact that it wasn't him, and then actually gave me an ultimatum, saying that I could either do something about this, or we'd have to go our separate ways, because he wanted a baby if I wasn't able to give that to him. Then he didn't see the point of us being together. That broke me, because I wouldn't mind staying even married without having a baby, because I loved him, but those feelings were not reciprocated. He only cared about having a baby, and saw me as a baby-producing machine more than his wife. By then, I was disheartened, even thinking that this was what my husband thought of me, and decided not to speak to him until he apologized to me. The apology never came, because after he had to leave for a business trip, and he didn't even bother to speak to me before he left. I was already very upset, and him leaving without saying goodbye to me hurt even more. After he left, I pacified myself by believing that it was some consolation, that he'd at least still added the details of his visit on our shared iCloud calendar, which was our ritual every time he'd have to travel for work. I tried to get along with my life for the next couple of days, because I knew that this would be a longer trip than usual, and he'd be away for at least 10 days this time. On the 3rd day of his trip, I was scrolling through Instagram, and then out of the blue, I came across my husband's ex-girlfriend's post. She was sitting by the pool in a bikini, and the place seemed really familiar. So, on a hunch, I decided to search the hotel that my husband was staying in, and sure enough, the setting matched what I'd seen on Google Maps. Just a couple of days back, I tried to make out whether it was the exact same place or not, and even made a call to the hotel front desk to confirm if she was staying there or not. I asked them to connect me to her room, and they did. So, within seconds, I heard her voice on the other end, repeatedly asking who this was. Of course, I didn't say anything and hung up without a word. I tried to force myself not to think of what might be happening, but there was no denying it anymore. And I knew that my husband was definitely cheating on me with his ex-girlfriend. It was lucky that I followed her online, and that they were still on good terms, because otherwise I never would have found out. It was only then that I began to think he'd probably even added the details of his trip on the calendar out of habit, not on purpose, because he wouldn't want me to find out about this. My doubts were confirmed when, after I'd seen that post, the details on the calendar were suddenly gone. It was too late though, because I'd already seen it and even taken a screenshot like I always did. He and his ex-girlfriend had been together for 2 years, but had broken up a couple of months before graduation. They'd stayed in touch after that and were really good friends, because she'd even attended our wedding. I did find it a little weird, but my husband reassured me that there was nothing brewing, and it was all in the past, so I had nothing to worry about. Besides, they would only meet each other in group settings with all their other friends, and otherwise she'd always be traveling, so I didn't think much of their friendship. She'd been nice to me, so I'd been following her Instagram account for a few years now, but I'd never imagined that it would actually come to my rescue someday after I processed the fact that the two of them were definitely together. I knew that I had to end this marriage right away. So I called a friend of mine and put me in touch with a divorce attorney as soon as possible. And he was able to arrange that for me overnight. Since he'd been divorced himself before, I explained the situation to the lawyer and asked them to draw divorce papers. I also decided to get a fertility test because I had a nagging feeling that there was nothing wrong with me and that my husband was just making excuses for his failure. So, within the next week, I filed a petition for divorce on grounds of infidelity and also got my test results back, which said that I had absolutely no problems relating to fertility, and there's no reason that I should be struggling to conceive. Everything I'd suspected was true, and I literally couldn't wait for my husband to come back home so I could throw these papers in his face and then dump him. I kept myself busy during those days, so I didn't even have the time to feel bad about what was happening to me. My only motive was to teach my husband a lesson of a lifetime. Then on the 11th day, he finally returned and tried to act casually around me. He even spoke to me and apologized for the fight we had before he left and said that he'd been looking into IVF recently and wanted us to try that. I didn't reply to anything and came straight to the point. I asked him where exactly he'd been staying these past 10 days for his work trip. He tried to beat around the bush and said that he didn't even remember the name of the hotel, but I could see him struggling. I even prompted him with the name of the place, and he tried to shrug it off. But then, I brought up that I'd seen a post on his ex-girlfriend's Instagram at the same place, which seemed like a really weird coincidence. He tried to ignore that, but I kept talking. Then finally I asked him if he'd met his ex on his trip. He denied it vehemently at first, but I just kept staring at him for like 7 to 8 minutes. Completely silently. And that's what finally made him tell me the truth. Not even the full truth. He just admitted that he had met his ex, but hadn't wanted to tell me about it because that would make me feel insecure, and he didn't want that. I told him that I wanted to know what exactly had happened, and he tried to change the topic, but I refused to let him. He gave in after a while. He told me that he had indeed met his ex-girlfriend and also slept with her, but it was just out of frustration. He confessed to me that he'd asked her to meet him one day before he left, and she agreed. Initially, he just intended to confirm was the one with fertility issues because he remembered very clearly that back in college they'd broken up because his ex had accidentally gotten pregnant while they were together, and he believed that it had been because of him. Unfortunately, when he discussed this with her, she confessed that she'd been cheating with another guy at the time, and the baby might not have been my husband's. He was disappointed and wanted to fly back home, but his ex convinced him to stay, and they ended up because he claimed that he'd just fallen weak. Now that the last hope that he had was also gone, he was just frustrated and couldn't take it anymore. So he slept with his ex-girlfriend. He explained everything to me really calmly, as if it was a very reasonable thing to do. He then told me that the reason he'd gone to confirm if he was the one with fertility issues instead of just getting tested was that the latter was much more terrifying and definitive. Jumping through hoops to arrange a secret holiday with his ex, only to ask about an accidental pregnancy that had happened ages ago, was a lot more convenient. Sleeping with her after that was even more convenient. He told me that after he learned that the pregnancy his ex had terminated in college might not have been caused by him, he decided to get tested at a hospital there, and it turned out that he was actually the one with fertility issues. Not me, he'd also realized that his ex had used him because she'd only stayed at the hotel for the first 5 days. Out of the 10 days, and after the 5th day, she'd taken off but promised to keep in touch. Of course, they'd spent the night together, but instead she blocked him everywhere the very next day. And he realized that this had been nothing but a one-off thing for her, and not the emotional reconciliation that he'd hoped for. He told me that he was sorry about everything, and that he'd only done these things because he was frustrated and really wanted a baby in a family of his own. Then he said to me that he'd realized that he'd screwed up, but he was still willing to give our marriage one last chance. He was willing to give our marriage one last chance because it was apparently his call to make in his head. That's when I burst out laughing, and didn't stop laughing until I handed over the divorce papers to him, along with the results of the fertility test. After going through those papers, he began to tell me that this was all really unnecessary and that we could still make things work, but I just didn't say anything. I already had my bags packed, and I've been recording our entire conversation on my phone all along, so I was good to go. After he told me the entire story of what had happened on his trip, I didn't need to waste more of my time arguing with him, so I decided to walk out that very instant. He got to his knees and started begging me to forgive him once he saw that I'd already packed my bags, but there was no changing what he'd done. So I ignored him, dragged my stuff to my car, got into it, and drove off, leaving him crying in the front yard. I drove to a friend's house, since I'd already asked her if I could live with her until the divorce had been sorted out, and she'd very kindly agreed to that. This was a friend of mine from college, and my husband doesn't know where she lives, so I know he won't be able to find me either. It's been almost 3 days since I left, and he's been texting me every day. But I haven't opened even a single text of his. I thought that he would give up eventually, but then today I received a call from my in-laws instead. My mother-in-law was totally out of control and was demanding that I return her son's calls or respond to his texts right that instant. I was panicking and asked her what exactly had happened, and she told me that my husband had apparently told her what had happened and was sobbing uncontrollably when he called her. He had even said multiple times that now that I was gone, he didn't see the point of going on with life anymore, and that he didn't even know what to do with himself, since he now knew that no matter how hard he tried, he'd never be able to have the life and family that he'd always shattered him. He had been so hysterical that my mother-in-law was afraid that he'd do something to himself and wanted me to call him back right that second. Now I think it was a little cruel, but when I heard all of that, I got really upset because that just sounded like he was trying to make me feel guilty. For looking out for myself. I just done what any self-respecting woman in my place would have done, and it felt like he was using that against me and making himself seem like the victim just because he was infertile. So, instead of calling him, I told his mother that he could do whatever he wanted to. Because now I wasn't his wife anymore because he cheated on me. She was shocked and said that I was being cruel, but I didn't really care and told her that her son deserved it because that's how upset I was. Then I hung up before she could waste more of my time and tried not to think about these things. Then about an hour ago, my husband texted me again, and this time I finally opened the text. It said that he was finally feeling better, and I didn't need to respond if I didn't feel like it. But he told me that the way I'd reacted to news had been nothing short of heartless, and now he felt like I never even loved him at all. He said that he wanted me to understand that he was also suffering and it wasn't just me who was going through a tough time because he was literally infertile and would never be able to have kids of his own, so I should have been kinder to him. So IITF for refusing to talk to my husband when his mother called me and told me that he was having a mental breakdown after he cheated on me. Update 1. 3 days since the original post. And before I begin, I'd just want to thank everyone who responded. It was nice of everyone here to be so supportive and kind to me. I get now that I should have dumped him as soon as he started blaming me for failing to get pregnant. But I'm not the kind of person to give up on relationships unless they show me for sure that they're not worth it, which he did by cheating on me. I didn't get back to my husband because there was no point. The reason he and his mother had tried to call was that they wanted to guilt trip and emotionally manipulate me into coming back to him. But I wasn't going to let them do that to me. I was also suffering just as much as he was, and even more so because I was the one who had been cheated on and had lost my marriage in less than a day. So for him to even insinuate that he was the victim of a situation like this was just ridiculous. He wasn't the victim. He was just pretending to be one so that it would be easier for him to manipulate me and make me seem like the bad guy for not caring about him. After he literally slept with a woman he told me he has nothing going on with, not just once but multiple times. So pardon me if I'm not so quick to forget that, as if nothing had even happened. He has been texting me continuously again, but I've just muted him and haven't opened his chat since the last time. He texted to tell me that I was being cruel to him. He has a couple of weeks to respond to the petition, but I'm sure he's going to try and get the divorce canceled somehow and is going to go out of his way to persuade me not to go through with it. But he doesn't know that I've already given up on him in this marriage. So, it's just a waste of time for him to try and convince me otherwise. I could have forgiven him for the infertility because it wasn't his fault, and I could have forgiven him for behaving badly, but I just cannot forgive him for cheating. Update to so I had to go back home today because I'd realized that I'd unintentionally left expensive bracelet back there, which my dad had gifted me. It had been a big mistake on my part to forget about something as important as while packing, but I was just feeling really out of it at the time as well. I wanted to go back home at a time when my husband wouldn't be there. But I knew that would be weird, and I didn't want to sneak into a place I used to call some burglar, so I steeled myself and went there after work today, without caring about whether my husband would be there or not. He seemed very happy to see me at the door and even tried to hug me. I guess he hadn't noticed that I wasn't even smiling, and neither was I looking at him. I pushed him away when he tried to hug me and told him that I was just there to collect some of my jewelry and then I'd be on my way. He seemed disappointed and told me that I was being heartless. He said that it was just one incident and I could just forgive him and move on. Instead of making such a big deal out of it, he even tried to tell me that he'd come to me himself, so I should at least take that into consideration, because at least he didn't lie to me. I had to try very, very hard to control the urge to slap him so he'd land up in outer space, and tried to ignore his meaningless blabbering. He continued to talk about how he had no contact with his ex as if that was his choice and not hers. She's the one who had blocked him, not the other way around. He'd been more than happy to continue speaking to her even now, had I not found out about them. Once I grabbed the box my bracelet was in, ready to leave, but he stopped me and blocked my way out of the bedroom by standing there in the doorway. He's considerably taller than me, and I was kind of scared at that moment, but he just stood there and told me that I had to at least give him a chance to explain. I had no other choice but to stand there and let him continue repeat the same things he told me several times before, like how he'd only slept with his ex out of frustration, and not because he actually wanted to, and that he didn't even like her because she'd used him. He told me that his ex had helped him realize how much he wasn't willing to give up on us so easily. He just needed one more chance, and he'd prove that he was a good husband, but I had to give him that one shot. I didn't intend on giving him that chance at all, just so I could leave. I told him that I'd think about it, and it seemed to cheer him up, and he let me go. He tried to hug me once more while I was leaving, but once again, I pushed him away and got into the car. I drove away as fast as I could because I just wanted to put as much distance between me and him. I came back home half an hour ago, and I'm still feeling annoyed that he even believes that he deserves a second chance. After what he did, I'm sure he's going to contest the divorce. But it doesn't really matter, since I know he cheated and I have the evidence to back it up. As well, it's just frustrating to know that he still doesn't see what he did was truly horrible. Nobody deserves a second chance after that. He blamed me and made me feel like absolute crap for not being able to conceive, when it was actually him who was the problem all along. This divorce couldn't have happened sooner. Update 3: my husband just has a week now to respond to the petition, but I guess he's still holding out hope that I'll somehow change my mind, even though I haven't responded to any of his calls or texts in ages. Today, I texted him back and said that he can't change my mind, so he'd better start looking for a lawyer, because he really shouldn't waste any more of his own time, as well as mine. He called me and asked me if I was actually serious, and I had to tell him that yes, I was, and that there was no chance in hell that I'd take him back. After what he'd done to me, he tried his best to talk me out of it, but I was just so exhausted that I didn't have anything to say to him, and if he didn't want to take this seriously, then that was on him. I'd warned him. And now the ball was in his court. My lawyer and I are already discussing the settlement, how to go about all of that, so he can fall behind by all means. I don't care. Update 4. He's not contesting the divorce. We're going straight to negotiations about the settlement. I'm hoping for a decent sum and a fair division of all our assets, and I know it'll be a cakewalk. Because of the proof that I have against him, he hasn't contacted me since our last phone call. But his mother sure has. In fact, she didn't even call me. She called my parents and tried to tell them, for raising a daughter like me, who had no sense of duty towards her husband. Apparently she expected me to forgive one tiny mistake and give him a second chance. But she didn't know my parents weren't the kind of people who supported that sort of attitude, especially when it came to infidelity. So, instead of her telling them off, it was she who got a talking to, and was told that her son was the one who had messed up here. So, if anything, she should be targeting him and not me, because I was just doing the right thing for myself. I'm glad my parents are on my side, and soon our friends will get to know me as well, because this is not something that I'm going to hide from them. Everybody should know what he did to me, barring the infertility, because that's not my business anymore. I hadn't cried or let any of my feelings out for a while, but now I feel like I can finally allow myself to relax and let my hair down, because things are finally heading in the right direction. Soon enough I'll be divorced and he'll be gone. Turn it lost.